Hey, what's going on, everyone? So the next ECW related video that I'm doing is the rise and fall of ECW. This is one of the best documentaries that the WWE ever produced. Very powerful. I would say it's probably the best documentary that was ever done by the WWE, because look at what happened after it. It was so successful that they brought ECW back. Very critically acclaimed. It sold very well. Led to the ECW One Night Stands coming back, and then eventually it led to the ECW television deal on Sci-Fi, which in retrospect was kind of a disaster. But but a very powerful documentary. I really think it's very controversial. I would say this, like a lot of fans that watched ECW back in the day, I think everyone enjoyed it, but I think the problem was a lot of the newer fans started acting like they were ECW experts. So I think it led to a lot of back and forth between the fans that actually watched it back in the day and the newer fans that were kind of latching onto it. So, like one of the things I used to hear is, oh, you can't call yourself an ECW expert just because you watched the rise and fall of ECW. But, I would actually say this, I think I'm a good person to say this, because I didn't watch it back in the day, and I've kind of, just become a fan since they went bankrupt. But I think I would say that, after watching this documentary, it pretty gives you like all you really need to know about the old school ECW. I mean, it pretty much covers all the important points. I mean, it doesn't go into depth about, guys like Hack Myers or guys like, even Jerry Lynn and Just Incredible, Lance Storm. I mean, doesn't really go into depth about guys like that, but still, I just think it gives you a nice, solid, background about what was really the important stuff that went down in the company. So yeah, man, I think this is great. So I'm just gonna, and a lot of, I would say this, I would say that there is just a lot of emotion here. ECW had, it hadn't even been 4 years since ECW went bankrupt when they shot this, but you could just see, like, especially with Tommy Dreamer, like a lot of the nostalgia and even with Taz, like a lot of the emotion really came out. This just told a great story. Heyman was on top of his game here. His sound bites and how Heyman ended this thing with his, what he said about failure. Really, this is just some of the best stuff that's ever been captured by the WWE in terms of storytelling. It was just this felt more like something you could have put in a movie theater than your normal WWE documentary. But yeah, I mean, you'll just learn a lot of ups and downs. I know Taz said he didn't like the title of it because it's the rise and fall, but there's a lot of controversial things that were said. I think what made the documentary great towards the end of it was that you had a lot of blame. Paul Heyman took a lot of heat on this thing, and but then when from Paul Heyman's perspective, he really, he was blaming it more so on the television deal than anything else. So you had a whole bunch of different personalities that had different opinions of what was going wrong. So let's start off. I'll try to go through this as quick as possible, because documentary reviews are very, very difficult to do, because there's just so much different things that you can talk about. Early ECW, they touched on the Public Enemy, how the Public Enemy were kind of, Taz said they were entertaining, weren't great wrestlers, but at least they brought something different to the table, just two tough guys from Philly. Then they touched on Taz and Sabu. Sabu was really a catch because, Heyman said, to the fans that hadn't seen ECW, you see Sabu and you're like, man, that's different. He had this reckless abandon style that you had never seen before. Terry Funk was very instrumental to ECW because he was a team player and he was established, and, he was an old man that was willing to put over younger talent, and, he wanted to make different guys. The night the line was crossed, a very, very important show, there was a three-way match with Terry Funk, who was it? Terry Funk, Sabu. Goddamn, who was the other guy in that match? See, I think it was Terry Funk, Sabu, and the Sandman, and it was like a three-way match. That's probably the most important match in ECW history. they touched on how Paul Heyman was very, very upset with WCW, wanted to put WCW out of business. They didn't touch on it, but there is a lot of anti-Semitism going on in WCW, and that was a huge part of it, but they didn't touch on it here. I think down the road, eventually they touched on it. Tommy Dreamer, when he came into ECW, he was pretty much like a pretty boy. He was someone that the fans hated, but slowly but surely, like the fans really started to respect Dreamer because he was, he didn't care. He'd be willing to put his body through anything. So, the Sandman, Paul Heyman said was the embodiment of ECW, which means like when you think of ECW, you think of the Sandman. And I think the Sandman is someone that would never have a shot in WWE or WCW. And that's what ECW did. They took a misfit or someone that just had no chance of making it in mainstream wrestling and just giving him the platform that he needed in ECW and just making a star out of someone that would just, never become a star. But the Sandman was different, though. The Sandman was able to get away with things that you could never get away with in mainstream wrestling. Then you had the whole Sandman and Tommy Dreamer feud, which they touched on, which was great. And Paul Heyman won Booker of the Year in 1994, and he won it 4 consecutive years. But it all started with Sandman and Dreamer, with Sandman selling the fact that he was blind. Dreamer taking the kendo stick shots to his back and bleeding. There was huge controversy with the kendo sticks over in Japan with the Singapore cane. That was a huge controversy at the time, and so you had that whole thing going on. The ECW evolution, Paul Heyman just said he wanted to change the industry, and ECW was totally different than anything else because of the revolutionary, fast-paced, hard-hitting action that no one else was really doing at the time. ECW really picked up the pace, as everyone pretty much knows. Cactus Jack, Foley took a lot of criticism from WCW because he spit on the WCW title. He actually came in with I believe it was the WCW Tag Team Championships, but at the time Foley was another one of these guys that was very, very upset with WCW, and he just cut a lot of his groundbreaking promos. And ECW was the place where Foley really made a name for himself as a one of the best promo guys in the business. These were some of the best promos of all time, as I think a lot of you guys know. Then they touched on Mikey Whipwreck. Whipwreck, just like the Sandman, like another one of these guys that would have never gotten a shot in mainstream wrestling. He was one of the ring guys. He used to put up the ring, but, loved to wrestle. And when he actually put him in the ring, the fans actually got behind him. And, Mikey Whipwreck, ended up being, probably one of the most valuable players in ECW when you look back at their history. All right, the Extreme begins in Philadelphia. Philadelphia ended up being the, pretty much the home of ECW. That's where a lot of the shows were originally done, the ECW Arena, Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia fans were just, Philadelphia, I would say, even, judging from wrestling and sports, it's one of the hardest places to satisfy fans. They boo anybody. You see what Bryce Harper's going through right now with the Phillies. If you don't deliver in Philadelphia, they have very, very little patience. So I would say that Philadelphia fans, even more so than New York and even Boston, are probably the toughest fans to satisfy. The technical wrestlers, obviously, you had a lot of great technicians coming through ECW, Benoit, Dean Malenko, Eddie Guerrero, even Chris Jericho. And, the thing was that ECW, they wanted to sell the fact they just didn't have hardcore wrestling, but you also had the best wrestlers. So like I said, around 1995, it's a great year because I felt like ECW tried to cover all the bases, even though they didn't have great production values. The Heyman's philosophy was to accentuate the positives and hide the negatives, which was a great philosophy, I thought. Then they touched on the fans, how the fans became part of the show. Even some of the fans, that you had the straw hat guy, you had that guy that always wore sunglasses in the front row. The fans, they kept showing up time and time again that they actually got quite over certain individuals in the crowd. People said that, the fans became, in ECW, the fans became, part of the show. Definitely. Raven and Tommy Dreamer, they touched on that feud. It was a huge feud in 1995, and it went on forever because Dreamer could never defeat Raven. These guys, the storyline was that both guys knew each other growing up, and, Dreamer was kind of good. Raven was evil. Beulah was a big part of the feud, and the feud went on forever. It was only in 1997 when Raven signed with WCW that they finally allowed Tommy Dreamer to get a victory over Raven. Sabu gets fired. They touch on that, and then Taz breaks his neck. Then they had set up the whole Taz and Sabu thing, which has started building up. Monday Night War. Let me see what was going on here. Monday, all right, because of the Monday Night War, Eric Bischoff started raiding talent. Then they had this whole back and forth about how Bischoff felt like he did not raid talent. These guys needed a place to basically Bischoff was saying that ECW, you couldn't make a living in ECW, so it was a no-brainer that Benoit and Malenko and Eddie Guerrero would come to WCW. But Vince chimed in and just said that he thought Bischoff should have gave something back. That it wasn't fair just to take those guys without giving back anything. So I can see that. I think that's fair. There was some "you sold out" chants to Eddie and Dean, but I think everyone knew, and that was, to me, like, I think that was the problem with ECW. The problem was, you couldn't build any consistency with some of these guys because you just couldn't compete with Ted Turner's checking account, or you couldn't compete with Vince's any of his assets. So it just became very, very difficult to afford talent. But at least Vince made himself look good here because he always said that he would try to give something back and kind of co-promote and work with them. Then you had Lucha Libre, you had Rey Mysterio kind of, picking up the pace here after all those guys leaving, and, Mysterio and the Extreme Lucha Libre really, carrying the company. Then Austin comes to ECW, and, they basically said that ECW was a place where you could come cut promos and vent your frustration. The promos just became, the promos really became one of the best things about ECW because they were real. They touched on things that, they touched on real life situations. They weren't kayfabe promos. They were really promos that basically exposed the business. So, it's always going to make it interesting. And it's always going to feel real when you do that. Cactus Jack leaves ECW, so that they touched on Foley's farewell when he signed with as Mankind to the WWE. And then Taz returns from the neck injury. And, they really started to promote Taz as a badass. The Sandman and the Raven feud. Heyman said this was the most emotional angle in ECW. Just talked about this in the ECW 1996 pay-per-view rewind because, and I didn't mention it, but, it was so emotional because Sandman didn't give a shit. He would get bloody, he would take an ass beating. But, the one thing, Raven was smart enough to realize that the one thing that could get underneath his skin was to turn his son against him. And, Raven saying, your son worships me. It was very, very evil. And so, yeah, it was probably the most emotional storyline, with the Sandman having a custody battle with his wife and his son, and the son actually turning on the Sandman. And then they talked about the whole BWO thing with, Stevie Richards becoming his own man. Beulah and Dreamer, they touched on how Beulah and Tommy Dreamer, they were in a relationship, and, WWE and ECW started co-promoting. They touched on the crucifixion with Raven and the Sandman, how Kurt Angle got so upset. So Angle said they'd be hearing from his attorney if his name was associated with the show. And then they touched on the pay-per-view, how important it was to get on pay-per-view because, it's just great exposure. Pay-per-view is a huge deal. I hate to say it, but, I really still think, and I know Gabe Sapolsky probably disagrees, but I still think Ring of Honor getting on pay-per-view was great for them. I think Ring of Honor getting on TV was a mistake, but I think pay-per-view was fine. I thought that was really big for Ring of Honor. I didn't start watching Ring of Honor religiously until they were on pay-per-view. So the pay-per-view deal was very, very important. And, the documentary really, really hit home with this because, with the pay-per-view, they kept on losing it. There were so many incidents where they were going over the top, the whole lesbian thing. I think that hurt some of the sponsorship deals with the television deal. And then there was an incident with New Jack where he beat up a minor that lied about his age. And then they lost their pay-per-view deal. And then there was a petition. Then the pay-per-view was back on. So just the back and forth with trying to get this thing done. Like, maybe the documentary made it sound tougher than it really was, but it just sounded very, very stressful and like a fight just to get on pay-per-view. And the WWE actually helped co-promote it. You know, Vince, he was kind of a team player. You know, he let the guys come to the In Your House pay-per-view, and I even remember I just started middle school at the time, and I wasn't a huge fan, but I would still watch Raw here and there. And I do remember hearing about ECW, so I had never heard about it before. But so that's good exposures. You had kids that were going to school that had never heard of ECW and finally knew about it. You had the Barely Legal pay-per-view heading up, and then Jerry Lawler actually was very adamant against ECW promoting on Monday Night Raw. So he didn't understand it, but Vince's mindset was that it was just good business down the road. Vince was thinking long term, which I think was smart. The main event at Barely Legal, they touched on that and how special that was with Terry Funk, getting the victory. They gave the belt to Terry Funk because he deserved it. They just thought it was a good story to see Terry Funk dethrone the up-and-coming Raven. Raven goes to WCW, then Jerry Lawler invades ECW. Jerry Lawler, he said he almost got killed when he went into ECW. Then they had a locker room mole. I believe it ended up being it was either Bill Alfonso or Todd Gordon. They didn't go too much into depth with it. Then they touched on the superstars' roles, Paul Heyman's creativity. Then WCW and WWE started imitating them with the whole Attitude Era. Then they touched on Taz and the Fuck the World title. The Dudleys, the most hated tag team. Yeah, they spent a lot of time on the Dudleys, and just Bubba Ray and some of the trash talking before some of the Dudleys matches were just crazy. Bubba had that one line where there was a mother and a daughter in the front row, and I think Bubba said something about how the mother taught the daughter to learn how to suck dick, which is really at that time it was just very, very that's it's crazy that he even got away with saying it. Like they illustrated the fact that the Dudleys sometimes they couldn't even get out of the arena because they were so hated. And then you start hearing about the financial situation. So when it seemed to me like when Paul Heyman started taking over the financial stuff, when Todd Gordon eventually started breaking away from funding the company, that's when it kind of went to shit. They said, Heyman was a creative genius, but as a businessman, he was horrible. And, I think that's one of the things in wrestling. You see, I think wrestling is a lot like, football. Mike Francesa always uses this analogy, when he talks about, a successful football team. He said, you got to have a great owner, a great coach, and a great quarterback, like the Patriots or even like the Giants, back in the day before they fucked up. And I think it's the same thing. I think Ring of Honor had it down. I think in 2006, you had a great owner, Kerry Silkin, you had a great booker, Gabe Sapolsky, and you had a great champion, whether Brian, Nigel, Joe, whoever, Punk. So I think it's kind of the same thing. But at this point, Heyman was I think you run into too many problems when you got one guy trying to do it all at once. Even Gabe Sapolsky with Evolve or Dragon Gate USA never really, he never really duplicated the success of Ring of Honor with that promotion, because he was trying to it was his own company and he was trying to book it at the same time. It's too much of a mess. I think it's better when you got specific roles for different guys. The TNN deal and Taz leaves ECW. So a huge blow. So ECW finally got a television deal with the national network. But the problem was Taz left like 2 weeks after they signed the deal while he was ECW champion. So as soon as they signed the deal, they were giving more money out. The Dudleys left, Taz left. So it kind of made Vince look bad. As soon as they got the deal, guys started leaving, and then you only had, Rob Van, even Kurt Angle. Kurt Angle wasn't watching ECW, but he's smart enough to realize that at this point, really the only attraction you had on a mainstream level was like Rob Van Dam with the ECW television title. So, you know, Heyman said that the biggest problem with ECW was this TNN deal. He said the TNN deal ruined the company because they didn't promote ECW. They were just using ECW as a guinea pig to see if wrestling would work. And they were going to offer Vince McMahon $100 million. And eventually they did. You know, Raw ended up debuting on the TNN network in September of 2000. So at that point, you know, they didn't put any promotion or any love into ECW, and they were constantly trying to censor things. And, you know, Heyman, for a while there, Heyman kind of used it to their advantage. They created a great character, Cyrus the Virus, which really gave ECW a lot of creativity and a lot of good storylines, you know, 1999 and going into 2000. Then you had this whole controversy with Mike Awesome jumping over, and then Dreamer won the tag team championship. You had a Mike Awesome versus Taz match for the ECW championship. You had a WWE guy versus a WCW guy for the ECW title. So that was pretty cool. Then, you know, the demise of ECW, you know, just a lot of people back and forth about what really went wrong with the company. Was it Paul Heyman a bad businessman, or was it the ECW on TNN deal? You know, just from the outside looking in, you know, I thought when Ring of Honor got on TV, the HDNet deal, you know, what the fuck did the HDNet deal do for Ring of Honor? When you look back on it, I just don't think it did anything for them. Do I think ECW needed to be on TNN? You know, it seemed to me like the ECW product in 2000, successful in terms of, you know, pay-per-view buys, in terms of critically acclaimed matches. I think ECW's last year, you know, everything was going well, I would say. I just think the problem was they just couldn't keep up. You know, they couldn't keep up with WWE or WCW. There was just no way to afford talent. And, you know, if television, if TNN wasn't going to promote, there was just no way that they were going to be able to keep up with affording them. So I think that was the biggest problem. And then on top of that, Heyman, you know, checks started bouncing, and, you know, certain guys' checks were bouncing, certain guys weren't. So you had half the roster upset, half the roster, like a guy like Van Dam, was willing to suck it up and just get through it. So you had a lot of guys that were, you know, just on different ends of the fence about whether to support the company, whether to just leave. And then Paul Heyman, you know, they declared for bankruptcy, and then Heyman went on Raw, and, you know, became broadcast partners with Jim Ross, and which started the great year of 2001 and the Invasion. And, you know, ECW pretty much done. So, yeah, man, but yeah, I mean, you know, some of the things that I loved about the documentary, you know, Taz was very emotional. They really gave some great sound bites with Taz about how, you know, is he a bad guy? Is he really, you know, turning his back on ECW by going to the WWE? He said, no, you know, I have a family. I got to look to the future. I have to do what's right for me. And, you know, Paul Heyman gave him his blessing. And, you know, Heyman, you know, by ending this, you know, just not being afraid to fail. There's nothing wrong with failing, because after you fail, you're twice as smart. You know what it's like to fail, and you learn from your mistakes. You know, learning from your mistakes was a big part of this documentary. Even Stevie Richards, you know, apologized and came clean and said, yeah, I just want to say, you know, just very, very genuine, just straight from the heart. Stevie Richards just said, yeah, I apologize for the way I left ECW. I just want to let everyone know I would never do that again, and I'm just really, really sorry. So this just felt very, very genuine. You could just tell a lot of the guys were very passionate about ECW. I think, you know, 3-4 years since they were gone, you really started to feel the nostalgia and the emotion come out. So yeah, this is just a great documentary. They touched on everything here. It's 3 hours of just really, really good stuff. You know, they jam. I really think they jammed a lot of the most important stuff in this documentary. They really didn't leave out a lot, to be completely honest with you. And you know, just touch on the matches briefly. The matches are really good. Now, Heyman said that he didn't think the matches were a good representation of ECW. To me, it just seemed like they were trying to go for star power here. That they wanted to get all of the bigger, you know, WWE stars on the set. You know, I think Heyman wanted a Terry Funk match because of how important Terry Funk was. I think Heyman also wanted a You know, a Shane Douglas match. You know, Shane Douglas didn't participate in the documentary. That's the one knock on it. You know, Shane Douglas was really valuable to ECW. You know, he really set the tone, you know, by taking the NWA title and in the tournament and, you know, throwing it down and converting it to the ECW championship. That was a very important part. So I think Heyman was upset that there was no Shane Douglas match or Terry Funk match because of how, you know, even the night the line was crossed match. I know it was like 40 minutes long, but, you know, that's probably the most important match in ECW's history. But, you know, they have the Pitbulls versus Raven and Stevie Richards from Gangsta's Paradise, the 2 out of 3 falls dog collar match. Rey Mysterio versus Psychosis, another 2 out of 3 falls match there. Mikey Whipwreck versus the Sandman. That's when Mikey Whipwreck won the ECW championship. Steve Austin actually came out before the match was over and cut a great promo and talking trash and called Mikey Whipwreck a loser and called Chris Benoit's wife a slut. And, you know, really just, you know, you could just tell Austin, just being himself there. Tuco Scorpio versus Sabu from CyberSlam 96. Great match that I just touched on, the ECW pay-per-view rewind. Tommy Dreamer and Raven, the whole blow-off match there. And then Jerry Lawler came out in the ECW arena. So that was a great environment and a great aftermath there. Taz versus Bam Bam Bigelow from Living Dangerously. You know, Taz and Bam Bam actually go through the ring, and then Van Dam and Jerry Lynn from Hardcore Heaven 99. You know, alternate commentary with Van Dam, Taz, and Tommy Dreamer there, so you get some nice little bonuses. So, yeah, I think the matches are pretty good. You get some of the best matches in ECW history. And, yeah, this is just a great compilation. Great DVD package. We're coming up on 15 years, so if you guys haven't seen this yet, definitely check it out. You could definitely see it on the network, and I'm out. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and that's it. All right.